All right, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. On Wednesday, we did verses 10 through 12. Paul is transitioning into his first major argument. He wants to show that his gospel was not according to man. He was not influenced by man. What he taught was nothing that he received from man or was taught by man. What he taught was through a revelation of Jesus Christ. And in typical Pauline fashion, he's going to proceed now to support the claim that he's just made. We did not do verses 13 and 14 on Wednesday, but Joe actually made some comments that touched on it. We looked at the if-then statement that Paul gives in verse 10. If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a bondservant of Christ. And what you're supposed to do is go, but you are a bondservant of Christ, therefore the antecedent cannot be true. It's a proof by contraposition or a reductio ad absurdum. He's saying if you assume that I were trying to please men, then it reduces to an absurdity, something that you know is not true, namely my not being a bondservant of Christ, but I am. And so the first part cannot be true. And Joe pointed that out to us. But let's read verses 13 and 14, which further supports the point. You've heard of my former manner of life in Judaism, how I used to persecute the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my contemporaries among my countrymen, being more extremely zealous for my ancestral traditions. So they had heard of his former life. Maybe they were aware of it from him. Maybe they were aware of it because when he was preaching to those churches that were in southern Galatia, he had these Jews that were chasing him from Iconium and Lystra and so on and trying to stone him and persecute him and get the people to rally and riot against him. Explain that, Paul. Well, let me tell you, I used to be with them, but things have changed. And so they were aware of his former life, and we're supposed to look at that and go, yeah, it's completely unlikely. If there were ever a person that it were unlikely for to take an about face and now pursue this thing that he tried to destroy, it was Paul. So if Paul were still engaging in trying to please men, then he wouldn't be doing what he was doing now. In 1:14, let's see, he talks about sort of who he was then. Again, he says, if I were still trying to please man. And he lets us into some of that insight through verses. In verse 14, there's sort of three things, right? He talks about advancing in Judaism, so that's a professional advance. He talks about comparing himself to his contemporaries, okay? So that's relative status among men. And then he says that he was extremely zealous for his ancestral traditions. So just let that sink in for a moment and think about how the influence of man might influence you. Might I or you or anyone be influenced by professional advance? Could that corrupt my understanding of the Bible? Might I be wrongly motivated by my relative status among men? Might I say what I want to say because I conclude that it's going to elevate my status among men or something like that, a particular group of people? Do I care about what mom and dad think about me? We've been in such and such church for so long. That's a zeal for ancestral traditions. Paul was influenced by that. We can as well.
And along those lines, it's not just what your family think about you or would think about you. It is, we get a lot of security, internal security from tradition, especially childhood tradition. It's kind of an anchor for us. And to give up something that has been part of us since childhood is a very difficult thing to do.
Right. So you said security. It can feel safe to stay there. It's cozy.
Yep.
Yeah.
Familiar.
Thanksgiving dinner will be pleasant.
Yep.
Yeah. But Paul gave it all up. And a lot of people have to do that. Make really tough decisions with regard to family, friends. I mean, what's Gamaliel going to think of me? Didn't matter for Paul.
Read.
Yes.
On the other side of what Tim's talking about there, I went against, my family religion when I became a member of the church.
Yeah.
And that caused a lot of hard conversations, even some estrangement, from my dad and me.
Yeah.
for
Oh,
a
I see.
term. So
I see.
that was not easy, but he did it anyway.
Right.
It shows his conviction, I think.
Yeah. Joe?
Well, I don't want to discount the gravity of Paul's conversion. I do think it's interesting that it wasn't that he heard the message and wrestled with it and then decided, you know what, yeah, I'm gonna become a Christian. If you think about the way he was converted, it's like the most forceful, in your face, as far as God presenting what he wanted him to do. And at that point, yeah, in theory, he could have said, no, I still don't want to do it. But for him, I think it's not just a normal conversion, it's a very unique conversion in his case. And I still think, obviously, he made the decision, but it was very, very direct on God's part.
Yeah. Yeah, God had set him apart before he was born for a particular work, and that's something that Paul's going to say next. Any other comments before we go to verses 15 and on? So let's keep in our minds what Paul is doing here. He wants to show that he's not influenced by man. And so why does Paul say what he says next? It's to make that point, okay? Is he giving a chronology, a particular sequence of events? He is going to give us a particular sequence of events, but like, what is particular about it? Well, it's that which supports the point that he's trying to make. It's not like he's trying to give you the most detailed history. He's giving you some aspects of his history that support his claim. All right, so let's just keep that at the forefront of our minds as we consider what he says next. He's going to go on to say, and what we're going to do right now, okay, is we're going to talk about the timing things, okay? And I had told you that this was coming for today to look at the parallel accounts of Paul's conversion in Acts and then what he has to say about it here in Galatians. And I find this relevant on a couple of points, not the least of which is that opponents of the Bible will use this as an example contradiction. And there's a couple of them. So and then what we're going to do after this is then probably Wednesday, if we get through everything today, we'll talk about like why Paul uses what he uses to support his case. I see it as kind of being, I don't think I have my notes for that section yet, but I see it as kind of breaking it up into three different sections, right? He's going to talk about when God called him, and then what happened in Damascus. And I guess it's four things, right? He didn't go and talk to anyone after he was originally converted. He went to Jerusalem only to acquaint himself with Peter. He was only there for 2 weeks. And then he was there another time 14 years later, or 11, depending on who you ask, and to show that he had this conference, or this meeting, sorry, disclosing my bias. He has this meeting with Peter and James, and says, they added nothing to me. On the contrary, right hand of fellowship, you go to the Gentiles, and we'll go to the circumcised. Only don't forget to remember the poor. Okay, so you can think about that. We'll talk about why Paul uses those distinct things to make his point on Wednesday, but let's talk about this timing issue. As we do, I first wanted to present two common fallacies that you'll run into. Okay, so when you see people attack the Bible for, a contradiction in particular, just keep this in mind. One is an argument from silence is a fallacy. Okay, this is the idea that because something is mentioned in Galatians, but said thing is not mentioned in Acts, therefore contradiction. Obviously, that's not the case. It could just be that Luke had a particular point he was trying to communicate and told certain details about the history that made that point, whereas Paul has a different point. What's Paul's point? We all know it. I've already said it 3 times. Paul's trying to support the claim that he was not influenced by men. Okay? Luke is trying to bring Theophilus up to speed on how the gospel was spread. And it's far more cursory and gross in nature. Paul gives us a more detailed account. So look out for this one. Just because one account gives you one detail and that detail is not in some other account, does not mean they contradict each other. The other one is a false dilemma. So this would be like, for example, an argument from silence would be like, Galatians says X. Acts doesn't. Okay. Therefore, contradiction. That's not true. A false dilemma would be like, Galatians says X, Acts says Y. Therefore, contradiction. And this, of course, only holds if X and Y are mutually exclusive, right? It assumes that X and Y cannot be true at the same time. And you'll see this especially with reasons, okay? So Luke will say, the reason Paul did blah, 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 blah. And Paul will say, the reason I did blah, 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 blah. And they're usually different reasons. But that doesn't mean that they can't be both true at the same time. Let me give you a concrete example in Acts. So turn to Acts chapter 9. Verses 29 and 30. And if you haven't already, I'd have your marker fixed in Acts and Galatians, because we'll do a lot of flipping back. So Acts chapter 9, verses 29 and 30. Now, Luke wrote all of Acts. Okay? So what I'm about to present to you is a potential contradiction within Acts. And anytime you see somebody do that, you should go, okay, if the same author is presenting two pieces of material that you're claiming is a contradiction, you must assume you have interpreted it incorrectly. It's the same author, okay? And they're not going to do that. It's probably more likely that you haven't gathered what they're trying to communicate. And so that's why I'm using this as an example. So in Acts chapter 9, verse 29 and 30, it says, he was talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. So this is Paul in Jerusalem the first time after his conversion, okay? And he's talking and arguing with Hellenistic Jews. But when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him away to Tarsus. Okay, so Paul flees Jerusalem. He had already left Damascus for the same reason, because of opponents breathing threats down his throat. And now, the way Luke communicates it, it's for the same reason. The brethren learn of a threat, and it says they sent Paul away. Now go to Acts chapter 22, verse 17. Same book. Same event being retold, this time by Paul. Acts 22:17. It happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I fell into a trance, and I saw him saying to me, make haste, get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves understand that in one synagogue after another I used to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your witness Stephen was being shed, I also was standing by approving and watching out for the coats of those who were slaying him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So in Paul's account, we're told that Jesus is the one who, in this trance, tells Paul to leave Jerusalem. But in the Acts 9 account, Luke says that it was because the brethren learned of the threats and sent him away. Those seem like two different reasons. But there's no reason why they couldn't both have been true. Okay? And so, especially within the same book, that's going to be a difficult claim for someone to maintain. All right, so let's talk about, it's pretty basic stuff, I understand. But if anyone has comments on that. All right, so the first potential discrepancy in Acts and Galatians, there's kind of two that I want to talk about, all right? These are the most common ones. Number one, Paul in Galatians says when he got back to Jerusalem, he came to Jerusalem to acquaint himself with Peter, and he stayed there 15 days, and he saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And what I'm writing to you before God, I do not lie. And then he went into the regions of Syria and Cilicia. He didn't see any one of the churches of Judea. They only were hearing it said, he who used to persecute us is now defending the faith he once tried to destroy, something like that. But in Acts, it says that Barnabas brought him to the apostles. Okay, so the apostles seems to be different than just Peter and James. All right, so what happened? That's the major one. Some people will say two different reasons, right? Paul in Galatians says he came to Jerusalem to acquaint himself with Peter, but in Acts 9 it says that he came to Jerusalem because he wanted to associate with the disciples, not just associate with Peter. Again, both can be true at the same time. In Galatians 1:22, Paul says he was unknown by sight to the Judean churches, but then in Acts chapter 9, it says that the brethren brought him to Caesarea and sent him away to Tarsus. The brethren. And some people will say that's the church. Okay. So just because, it would be like someone coming here and, I don't know, meeting with a few people from Taylor's Church of Christ, and yet that person never comes and preaches here or never attends a worship service here. That may well have been the case. And as far as I'm concerned, that's not a discrepancy. But the more major one that you'll see talked about more often is, how is it that Paul says he only acquainted himself with Peter and James, and that's it? He saw no one else. But Luke says that Barnabas brought him to the apostles. And the reason why that kind of matters in the Galatians case is because Paul's point, what's Paul's point? I wasn't influenced by man. Look, man, I didn't go to Jerusalem until 3 years after my conversion, and I only saw Peter. And it was only for 15 days. Like, that's the point he's trying to make. You guys want to say I was trained, like I got a Bachelor of Science in Gospel from Peter? That couldn't have happened. Look at how infrequently I was with him. Okay, that's the claim he's trying to make. But if someone wants to say, oh, you saw more than Peter, because Luke says Barnabas brought you to the apostles. Okay, what would you all say to that?
What are Peter and James?
Peter and James? Yeah, excellent. Peter and James, what's the point?
They are apostles.
They are apostles, yeah.
Plural. There's
Mhm.
two of them.
Okay. Yeah, so you could say he saw apostles, two of them, Peter and James. Somebody might say, well, is James an apostle?
We're talking about James, the Lord's brother.
Mhm.
He wasn't, no.
Okay.
Or was it the other James?
Well, wasn't James son of Zebedee? Oh, it could have been, right? Could have been. He wasn't dead yet. Could have been James, the son of Alphaeus. You don't see much talked about him. But it was definitely James, the Lord's brother. I mean, because it says that in Galatians.
James and John.
Paul seems to associate him as an apostle, right? I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. I'm happy to hear other thoughts. I tend to think that he was. Not in the sense that he was one of the 12 apostles, but we have inspired scripture by him. He was an opponent, at least he didn't believe in Jesus before his death, but he's in the upper room in Acts chapter 1 with Mary and the other apostles. He saw the resurrected Jesus. And is that too hard to believe that that's probably what converted him? And if I learn one day that Jesus spoke to him and gave him a mission, then I'm fine with understanding it that way. But, maybe it just means an apostle in the sense that, more generally one sent. I don't know. Go ahead.
I don't recall, but the James that kind of makes the concluding remarks in Acts 15 in the council, that's after
the
death of
son of Zebedee was beheaded.
right.
Yeah, that's probably James, the Lord's brother. It's probably the same one in 1 Corinthians 15 when Paul's recounting, I delivered to you what I first received from him, death, burial, resurrection. So many people saw him, and he seems to include James along with Peter in the list there. I think that's right.
I have a question.
Yes.
In Acts 9, does yours read apostles or disciples on verse 26?
Verse 26, it says disciples, but in 27, but Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles. Yeah. So the other way that I think that what this could mean is it's like, if somebody wants to meet with the elders at Taylor's Church of Christ, I might drive them to Taylor's Church of Christ and anticipate the elders being there because maybe that's where they are on a regular basis. And lo and behold, only Alan and David are there. Now, is it true that I brought such and such a person to meet the elders? Yes, that's a true statement. And is it also true that such and such a person met only with Alan and David? Yes, it would be true. So it doesn't present a contradiction. Yes?
Well, when Paul words this in verse 18, he visited Cephas, remained in 15 days, but I saw none of the apostles except James. He would have said Peter and James if he meant James was the apostle. He says Peter, except Peter. He's also other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. So it's just the way he words it. He's not saying James is one of the 12, just saying James.
Oh, he certainly was not one of the 12. And there's only 12 of those,
Yeah.
and for sure he wasn't one of them.
Well, James was one of the elders in the Jerusalem church.
Seems like it, yeah. Yep.
As far as the different visits that Paul had to Jerusalem, because I know we were talking about like which visit is which, and which one is he describing. So with because there's 3 recorded visits in Acts, correct?
Oh, there's 5 in Acts.
Or excuse me, prior to, including Acts 15 before.
There's 3.
Those 3.
Yeah, post-conversion, famine
Right.
relief, after first missionary journey.
Yeah, so these, I guess it goes back to which of the visits are these, and is
okay.
the later one described, is that the Acts 15
Yeah.
visit and so on?
Right. So let's do that. Let's jump into that one. That's the more common claim is that, well, it's more interesting, I guess, whether or not, the common question comes up, like, is the meeting with Peter and James in Jerusalem that Paul's describing in Galatians chapter 2, is that the Acts 15 council or not? And obviously this has immediate implications for when you think the letter was written. All right, so where's my black pen? Oh, use it as a marker. No pun intended. Let's do this. Galatians 2 is Acts 15. Okay? That's what some people think. And what are some reasons why you might think that Acts 15 and Galatians 2 are talking about the same thing? One is the same debate is in question. It clearly has to do with circumcision in Acts 15. Some men were coming up saying that unless you are circumcised, you cannot be saved. And in Galatians chapter 2, it's obviously about circumcision as well. That's why he brings Titus, and that's why he says explicitly, Titus, although he was a Greek, was not compelled to be circumcised. And then they leave. It seems to be on the same page. So the outcome seems to be the same as well. The debate surrounds circumcision, and everybody seems to leave on the same page. Gentiles do not need to become Jews to become Christians. Okay? That seems to be the case in both places. The people that are involved, right? In both places, you've got Paul and Barnabas, Peter and James. Okay? So at least the same people are involved where it mentions people. Paul's presentation. So in Acts 15, multiple people talk. I think Peter talks first, and then Paul and Barnabas recount their work among the Gentiles, and then James talks. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says he went up and submitted to them the gospel that he preaches among the Gentiles. And so in both cases, he's recounting, circumstances of his preaching to the Gentiles. So Paul's presentation is the same in both. The last one is maybe on timing. So no matter how you slice it, Paul has to have spent a lot of time, it seems like, in Tarsus. Right? So he's in Jerusalem. He asks for letters from the high priest to be able to go and imprison Christians in Damascus. He's on his way. He's converted. He goes away into Arabia. 3 years later, after the persecution by Aretas, he comes back to Jerusalem, and then it says he went to Syria and Cilicia. Okay? And then we know that Barnabas is going to eventually come and get him, and then they'll spend a year in Antioch. So if you start doing this 3 years, 14 years thing, that's, whether it's Acts 15 or Acts 11, and it seems like it has to be one of those. Some people, I think Luther had it like the Acts 18 visit, or actually some people will claim it's a visit that was not recorded in Acts. It just seems like such a stretch. It seems like it's at least got to be either Acts 11 or Acts 15. But if you start to kind of count back from, this 3 years and 14 years, where is all this time being spent? I mean, is the first missionary journey take 10 years? And what most people think is either you have a 10-year stint in Syria and Cilicia, of which Luke says hardly anything, until Barnabas comes up and gets him, or it's got to be 5 years, if you're going to make the numbers work, okay? So the fact that Luke says nothing about his whereabouts, was he preaching there? Probably. I mean, he was preaching in Damascus as soon as he was converted, and that was right after his conversion. This is now after, he's back in his hometown in Cilicia. And so on the timing piece, it puts, if you assume that Galatians 2 is Acts 15, there's more time, and he would have, that Tarsus stint is less. What I'm giving you is like what you'll read about, okay? So this is what some people say. It's like Luke says very little about his stint in Tarsus, and that's a little bit more, it seems like more reasonable with this approach here. Now there are some arguments against it, and David's not here, but he would be the first to tell us what. He's brought this up about 3 times. What's the argument against? The main argument against Galatians 2 can't be Acts 15. What will someone say?
They're not bringing up the letter
Yeah.
that's distributed.
Why didn't he bring up the letter then? The Acts 15 letter is not mentioned. And so if Paul's describing and even wrote Galatians, right? People want to push this back to pre-Acts 15 because the letter's not mentioned at all. And they want to say, so this meeting had to happen before Acts 15, and in fact the letter was written before Acts 15. Because if it wasn't, then surely Paul would have mentioned that, right? Now what's the rebuttal to that? It kind of undermines Paul's point, right? Why is Paul telling you about an interaction with Peter and James in the first place? It's because people were saying that he was influenced by them. Peter's telling you what he's telling you, or Paul's telling you what he's telling you because he wants to elevate his status among the pillars, the men of reputation, those who were influential. That's not my words, that's Paul's words. He's telling you that that's how people viewed them. And Paul wants to show you that his gospel is independent of Peter and James. It's independent. It's not different, in fact. It's the same gospel, but it was independent. He didn't learn it from Peter and James. And so Paul doesn't need to cite the Acts 15 letter. Paul has already preached to these Galatian churches and told them what he told them. If he now says, see, I got a signed document from James and Peter, so now you should believe me. No, you should believe him first of all because he got his revelation from Jesus. And he confirmed that with miracles. And you can read about those in Acts, chapter 13 and 14. So that's the rebuttal to this is Paul doesn't need to mention it, and he's not going to mention it because it undermines his case here. What Paul wants to show is that he had agreement, That's what the Paul, I think, brought the letter. I mean, first of all, Acts 15, the letter that was written by James and the elders in the church, was addressed, I think, only to Syria and Cilicia.
It's Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia.
Antioch, Syria, and Cilicia, right. Now, he definitely delivered it to those South Galatian regions, right? You read about that in Acts 16. But it wasn't to say, see, I told you I'm right. It's to show you we are teaching the same thing as those people in Jerusalem, right? Paul's not saying, now believe me because Peter and James agree with me. He's saying we're all on the same page. It's about showing agreement among the brethren, not authority. He's not authorizing his teaching from Peter and James. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the rebuttal to that one. Okay, this is the other big one.
I was going to have to make one
Yeah,
quick
go
comment.
ahead.
It is interesting to me to just think about Peter's position through all of these different interactions, him being the first one, and he even mentions it in Acts 15 to talk with Cornelius and preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And so it's kind of interesting to see how his position is described in Galatians, depending on where the dating is, where he has this issue with separating himself from the Gentiles. Just like I mentioned, I think before, it doesn't seem like he would have done that after going through all of this.
Oh, Peter?
Peter doesn't
Oh,
seem like
okay.
he would have. If they've already settled all this, already gone through all this, it seems like he wouldn't have done that at that point. Not to say he couldn't have had a moral weakness.
So and yes, so that's one of them, right? How can you explain Peter's follow-up actions? And there's it's a valid point. It's harder to believe, right? However, I mean, the rebuttal to that is, let's say it's Acts 11, and Luke does not record this apparently important meeting between Paul and Barnabas and Peter and James, where they send Paul and Barnabas, give the right hand of fellowship, and they go and they do their first missionary journey. At some point after that, also, Peter is going to have to arrive in Antioch, and Paul is going to approach him to his face. It may not be as unlikely, but it seems at least also unlikely that Peter would have done that after this thing happened here. Think about what Peter cites in Acts 15. Peter's the first one to speak up in Acts 15, and he cites the vision that he had, the interactions he had with Cornelius. We know that the gospel has not been precluded from being sent to the Gentiles. Peter knows this in his head. As far as I can tell, that event in Antioch was a weakness of Peter. Peter should have known not to engage in the activity that he did. His sin was he was being hypocritical, right? Paul talks about as a matter of conscience, a Jew may have a problem eating pork, for example, and as a matter of conscience, abstain from that. And Peter says, or Paul, tells us to not judge that person, to bear with them and be patient with them is the encouragement that he gives in Romans. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Peter was associating with the Gentiles. He was. It wasn't bearing on his conscience. But then people see him. Men from James come up, and now I separate. It's the hypocrisy. It's not that Peter was violating his conscience in associating with the Gentiles. It's the hypocrisy that I'll behave one way when certain people are watching, but now that these people come up and see me, and that's what Paul calls him out on. Because is there a greater threat to division in the early church with Peter behaving that way? And so it was vitally important that Paul speak up in that moment. Yeah.
This seems typical of Peter, is his behavior. Usually he caves when he's under pressure. And we saw this when he denied the Lord 3 times. And he seems to back away, distances himself from the Gentiles when he questioned him.
Yeah, of course, you see Peter's the one who walks on the water and then he sinks. Peter's the one who, well, what about him, Lord? When they're walking on the beach with James after they've eaten fish for breakfast. Can you imagine? And Peter's the one who denies the Lord. But then you see, the next time you see Peter, he's bold in Acts 2. He's bold in Acts 4. How can we speak but what God tells us to speak is what he tells the Jewish leadership in Acts chapter 4. So you do see this remarkable transition in Peter And yet there are still weaknesses. And it's, I mean, the immediately thing is to relate it to us. Okay, there's a progression that all of us will experience, and we should become more and more bold and more strong in our faith. And that's evident in Peter.
So do we behave that way when we're at work and our co-workers question our faith? Do we back away?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an important thing to reflect on. The last one that I'll mention today, and we'll look at evidence for it being the Acts 11 famine relief visit. The other one is the chronology. Okay, so basically, Paul says he was in Damascus. He goes away for 3 years into Arabia, and then he's in Arabia. After 3 years, he goes to Jerusalem. That's the first visit that Paul mentions in Galatians. And then he says 14 years later, he was there again. Now, some people want to go, Paul is giving you every single visit to Galatians in sequence. And if that's the case, then you go, okay, well, what was the second visit to Jerusalem in sequence in Luke's account? Acts 11, when he goes with Barnabas to deliver famine relief funds because of the prophecy of Agabus. What's the rebuttal to that? Paul's not detailing every visit to Jerusalem. He's only telling you substantial interactions with people like Peter and James, men of repute, because his claim is, I wasn't influenced by them. Okay? Paul's intention is not to give you every single detail. He's giving you the detail that supports his point. And I know I've said that ad nauseum, but it's because I find it to be rather important to keep that context in your minds to understand why Paul is telling us what he's telling us. Okay, we got a minute. One more. The reason for going up. In Galatians chapter 2, if they are the same, in Galatians 2 it says that he went up because of a revelation. In Galatians 15 it says they went up because the brethren sent them. Now we've already dealt with this one, right? That's the same, to conclude, therefore contradiction, they can't be the same, is the same type of fallacy that someone might use to claim a contradiction between Acts 9 and Acts 22 in the reasons for Paul being sent out of Jerusalem after his first visit to Jerusalem, after his conversion. So that one doesn't really hold a lot of water. You'll see some other things like, well, Titus is not mentioned in Acts 15. Okay, argument from silence. John's not mentioned in Acts 15. Arguments from silence. He could have been there. It doesn't say it was just Peter and James. I think it says the elders, the apostles were there. And then the last one is that Acts 15 was a public matter while Galatians 2 is private. Although if you go back and you look at Acts chapter 15 and verse 6, it seems like there was a meeting with everyone, but then the elders and the apostles get together to talk. And some people think that was where the meat of the discussion happened was in a more private setting. And that could be justified from chapter 15 and verse 6 in Acts. All right, so that's a little overview. We'll look at some ideas that people use to support Galatians 2 being Acts 11. And then we're going to dive into the reasons why Paul is talking about these things to support his claim. Okay, see y'all Wednesday.